let's get down to the nuts and bolts of the policy process. So this is kind of actually the way that policy gets made, not theories of policy change, not your ideas about how policy change should happen, but actually how policy does get made. If you've taken a public policy course, or if you've taken an American government course where policy was covered, you may be familiar with this. I should also say the policy process sometimes is presented as a set of 5 steps or a cycle of 5 stages. This text presents it as 4, and so I'm going to stick with that. And in the first stage, I'm going to kind of elaborate on what should be really 2 stages. It'll all make sense, I promise. All right, so the first phase is formulation, right? And I'm rolling into this what in other formulations of the policy process is really 2 stages. Problem identification and agenda setting, and policy formulation. So when we're talking about problem identification and agenda setting, it's exactly what it sounds like. And frankly, a lot of people, a lot of policy scholars would consider this to be the most important stage or phase of the policy process, because without attention, without defining a problem and then getting it on the agenda for decision making, it'll get no notice or response, right? So bringing the problem to the forefront, explaining why it's a problem, and actually getting it on the agenda, the public agenda or the governmental agenda, either one, is very important. We don't get to the other stages of the process without that. It does have high conflict potential, because framing the issue is critical, and framing often comes down to politics, right? So, for example, how do we frame the issue of juvenile violence and school killings? Is it a firearms issue? Is it an access to guns issue? Is it a school safety issue? Is it a bullying issue? Is it a mental illness issue? Is it a video games and violence in media issue, right? So depending on how you frame that particular problem, you might engender different types of responses and different types of conflicts. So when you identify your problem and you're thinking about your problem identification, that's a really important part of it. So how are you framing it? What is the source of this problem? How are we looking at this problem? How are we framing it? Because of that, problem definition is highly subject to bias and political bias, right? Problem definition is a matter of whose point of view is getting heard. You know, you've probably heard the old saying, where you stand depends on where you sit. Different people have different life experiences, and for that reason, they're going to have a different view of that problem. So like we just said with the juvenile violence and school shootings, right? Depending on your personal experience, the way you were socialized, the culture you grew up in, you're going to have a very different idea about what the actual cause of that problem is. And if we disagree on the causes of the problems, we're obviously going to disagree on the solutions needed to fix it, right? So this is a highly political stage in the policy process. And one of the reasons it's highly political is that there's a lot of competition for agenda space. Policymakers, whether they're legislative, executive, or judicial, only have so much time in the day, and so many days in the year, and so many years in their terms. And so there's a real competition for what issues are going to get addressed when. In order to get your policy issue or your problem on the agenda, you typically need one of 3 things, and if you have all 3 of these things, it's even better. You need a policy entrepreneur, so somebody who works in a think tank or for government or for an advocacy organization or interest group whose job it is really to identify problems and shine light on them. Or you need the media, right? You need the media to highlight the problem, to pay attention to it, to bring it to the attention of others, and to do that on a consistent basis, right? So that the problem is constantly being addressed or looked at in the media. When I say the media, I don't just mean cable news. I mean newspapers, magazines, video content, digital content, right? BuzzFeed even sometimes brings policy issues to the forefront. So, keeping attention on the issue. Or you need a social movement. You need a grassroots political movement or a grassroots political organization who cares about the same issue or problem that you do, and can marshal human resources and put grassroots pressure on politicians to address it, right? So very critical part of this formulation phase. Then, of course, the actual formulation of policy options, right? When we talk about policy formulation, that's what we're talking about, is developing proposed courses of action to solve your problem, or propose, right, different policy solutions, different policy proposals. Policy alternatives are continuously being evaluated in America by the groups that tend to formulate policy solutions. So that would be, of course, legislators, people in the role, in executive branch roles and positions, but also informal actors like interest groups, advocacy groups, and think tanks, right? People develop solutions to problems all the time, even before those problems get on the agenda, right? So there are people sitting at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative leaning think tank, and the Urban Institute, which is a liberal leaning think tank, whose job it is really to look at various solutions to problems. And then when that problem gets on the agenda, when the media starts paying attention, or when a policy entrepreneur or social movement brings it to the forefront, those think tanks, those advocacy groups, those interest groups are ready with a solution because they've been working on this problem already, right? This is a technical process, though. Policy formulation is a highly technical process. Facts matter, right? If we're trying to solve a scientific problem, you got to base the solution on science, right? It's a no-brainer. This is not the place for political bias, partisanship, or ideology. We are looking at real solutions to real problems here. That's not to say that there aren't political moments or biases that enter in here. There certainly are, right? If we think about interest groups that represent different types of interests, right? So we might have professional associations, like the Bar Association, like a union for a particular industry, who have one view on environmental regulation, and then environmental advocacy groups have another view, and they're going to formulate very different solutions to the same set of problems, right? So there certainly are politics here, but the solutions themselves can't be based in ideology alone. The solutions themselves have to be technically correct to solve the problem. The second phase of the policy process is actual legislation. So legitimation of those policy solutions that we formulated in phase one. Here, again, we're adding legitimacy to policy actions by giving them legal force, right? We're actually making laws. I kind of hate that this phase is called legislation because let me make it clear that policy solutions don't just get legitimated or put into action by legislatures. Executive branches have power to do this. Certainly the President of the United States can issue executive orders. That is a legislative tool. Judiciaries make policy. Whether you think they should or not, they do, on both the right and the left, right? So, you know, legislation is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. Let's call it lawmaking, the lawmaking phase, right? I won't belabor how legislation gets made because if you want to review that, you can click on this link here and we can skip verification and we can go to the internet in just a moment. Yes, sorry, it's a little slow on the recording here. And you can watch that good old-fashioned classic Schoolhouse Rock, and Schoolhouse Rock will tell you how a bill becomes a law, right? He's just a bill. Yes, he's only a bill, and he's sitting there on Capitol Hill, right? So,
your body grows bigger,
I'll let you guys watch that on your own time. But just a refresher on how a bill becomes a law. So let's go back over here. When legislation is made, and when a policy proposal is made in a legislative format, it is recorded in the congressional record. The congressional record is simply a record of all legislation that's introduced. You can visit that link, and you can see the current term, the current Congress. You can look at any previous Congress, and you can see all of the bills and legislative proposals. They usually put out a daily digest here, so you can see here the daily digest in the Senate. It'll show you, hey, on September 28th, that was Friday, 8 bills and 4 resolutions were introduced. That doesn't mean they were voted on or debated. They were introduced that day. And then you can see kind of what was introduced and what was reported on that given day, right? So you have a nice record and a nice way to track legislation as well. Just again, on the refresher, Schoolhouse Rock, legislative proposals are introduced in either the House or the Senate. They're printed in the congressional record. Ideally, a deliberative process will follow, right? That's the way the Constitution says it's supposed to happen. And when I say deliberative process, I mean the whole 9 yards. The bill's assigned to a committee. That committee holds hearings, preferably public hearings. The committee then marks up the bill, like literally edits it, adds things, changes things. And then the committee votes. If they vote the bill out of committee, so they vote to pass the bill out of committee, it would go to a floor vote in the chamber with whatever rules that chamber uses for floor votes. If it passes, the other chamber then has to pass its own version of that bill. Once it goes through the process in the other chamber, the two come together in conference committee. They work out the differences in their bills. There's a final vote, and you have legislation. And then the president can sign it or veto it, right? That's what should happen. Unfortunately, in today's congressional climate, the deliberative process has been somewhat hijacked, I guess, or it doesn't work so well anymore. I'm going to leave that to another politics class to cover, although it does have significant impacts. Gridlock obviously has significant impacts for policy making. One of the things I want to highlight here, though, is that when it comes to legislation, I cannot stress to you enough the importance of staff. Both committee staff, people who work on a specific committee, means they don't work for any particular member. They work for the committee itself, and typically they have some policy expertise related to the committee on which they work. But also individual staff, so staff members that work for specific members of Congress, either in the House or the Senate, who work in their offices every day, who are doing policy research, who are drafting legislation, and participating in that process directly. These are the folks who really are doing the backbone of the lawmaking. They may not be making the deals, although having interned in an office, I sometimes did see staff cut deals, but they're definitely doing kind of the actual pen to paper work of crafting legislation very often. Part of that is reflected in the Congressional Research Service, which is a body within the Congress that does exactly what its name suggests. It provides research reports on specific policy issues. Now, we're really lucky because the Congressional Research Service, it used to be that they didn't publish their reports for the public. You could call your member of Congress and they may or may not share it with you, whatever you're looking for. But now the Library of Congress has put them online. And so you can follow the link that I just clicked to the CRS Reports website. I'm just going to click search here because that'll take us to a full index of CRS research projects, or products rather, reports. And you can kind of see the different types of reports that they have produced recently. So just on Friday, they released a report on errors and fraud in the SNAP program, which most people think of as food stamps, right? So really important research to look at. And then finally, the House Ways and Means Committee produces the Green Book. And the Green Book is a nice, handy research reference for all social programs. So if a member of the House or Senate wants to know something about a